Welcome back to AM Agenda. With me, Richard Marles and Matthias Cormann, our panel of politicians. Matthias, to you on the mining tax. The government has released a document today, a letter from 21 economists backing the mining tax. Some pretty eminent people on this list, Alan Fell's among them. What's your response?
Well, look, I mean, this is a bad tax which rewards failure and penalises success. It's
tax getting some endorsement, isn't it?
Well, I mean, there's now a theoretical debate happening across economists. I find it very hard to understand that any economist would support a tax which signs the government up to 40% of any failed mining venture across Australia without having any input into investment decisions, the level of risk, management performance, everything else like that. I mean, this is a bad and lazy tax grab which will cost jobs, which will be bad for investment, it'll be bad for retirees, it'll be bad for prosperity moving forward, and it's a tax that Labor should scrap. It's not in our national interest. The reason Labor is pursuing it is because they needed to come up with a political fix for the record levels of debt and deficit that they got our country into, and really they're now scrambling left, right and centre to come up with questionable data and all sorts of arguments that don't stand up to scrutiny to justify something that was ill thought out right from the start.
But Matthias, you from Western Australia, the resource state, the boom state. Why should the prices that come in? It's just in terms of which break down the complexity of this argument to that very basic point. If the prices have soared over the last 5 years, 6 years, why shouldn't the Australian people get a share of that windfall?
Well, I mean, the Australian people are getting a share, and I mean, I think that the one thing that has come out of this debate is that there's now a general acknowledgement that the mining sector pays about 41% in taxes, if you include the royalty payments into that, of course, which are imposed by the states. And if Rudd's bad tax were to come into effect, that would, of course, go up to about 58%. That is no longer fair or reasonable. I mean, this is just reckless, and this is not driven by what is in the national interest. This is driven by a government that is desperate to come up with a quick fix for the debt and deficit that they've taken our country into.
Richard Marles, the government cites this letter of 21 economists today, but I'm sure that the coalition could come up with a list almost as long of business economists and others. Citigroup yesterday was the document that Joe Hockey referred to. Respected analysts backing the coalition's numbers that the mining industry is paying a substantial amount of tax already.
Well, firstly, this is a very significant intervention in this debate by the 20 economists. We've got Alan Fels, Fred Argy, Nicholas Gruen amongst that list. They are making it clear that this is a much more efficient tax, one which is on profit at the end of the line rather than on royalties on production along the way. They actually say this will help mining exploration rather than hinder it. They make the point that in providing subsidies where mining isn't profitable, that in fact there is a counter-cyclical nature to this which will take some of the risk out of mining exploration. So this is it's a smart tax. It's not a knee-jerk reaction. This has come through actually years of planning after the Henry tax review, which started very much from the beginning of the life of this government. But I'd make this point about what you're saying with competing versions out there. I'm yet to hear an economist say that the system of state royalties is a good system for retrieving for the Australian people value out of a product, a resource which is theirs.
Do you think the government's selling this well enough? Because 4 of your colleagues in the caucus yesterday had to ask for more detail. There seems a lot of confusion out there, a lot of different numbers flying around like confetti at the moment. Is the government doing a good enough job in selling this? Because they certainly botched the ETS.
Well, I don't accept that last point.
Well, they have. The reality
the reality with the ETS.
You're running away from it.
The reality with the ETS is that we had an opposition which have been blocking it consistently in the Senate, and that's the reason the ETS is not on the table.
You're not prepared to fight a campaign on it.
Well, let's be clear of why the ETS is not around at the moment. It's absolutely because of what the opposition's been doing. Look, I've heard this line about 4 people in the caucus. I was in the meeting. It's not what I heard actually in the meeting. I think that there is a job in selling this, and I think we're going through that job, and I think we're doing it well. These are big issues. They take time to sink in, and I think we're working through the process of that. But I'm sure at the end of the day, the Australian people will want to see a regime which encourages mining exploration. That's what we're doing. That's what the 20 economists say, and give us a fair return for a resource which belongs to the Australian people.
Matthias Cormann, two key members of the Henry Review, Greg Smith and Heather Ridout, have both told the Financial Review today that there is scope for the government to compromise on this tax without destroying the intent of it. Do you see any hope of a compromise here if the government lifted increased the uplift rate from where the super tax profit is defined as when this tax kicks in? Is there any sign of a compromise that you'd support?
The government has completely stuffed this up. This is a bad tax. They've gone about it the wrong way. It's a tax that will be bad for our economy, bad for jobs. We think that the government should just scrap this whole thing altogether. They should do it today. What's been happening with investment already leaving Australia, with projects already being taken off the board, this is already hurting Australia. And if the government, here Richard talks about the Henry Tax Review. We were promised a root and branch reform of our tax system, a strategic review, a simpler, fairer, better tax system. And all we got is a bad old-fashioned lazy tax grab. And of course, the reason Labor went for these resources, so-called super profits tax, is because they thought the mining industry was a soft target. They're always looking for another soft target to tax. They thought they could run a campaign against so-called rich, fat mining bosses, nasty multinational capitalists that are exploiting Australia. This was about coming up with a tax grab that they thought they could sell in the lead up to the next election. The reality is they didn't do their homework, they didn't think it through. This is hurting Australia. It's a tax that we should scrap, that the Labor government should scrap today if they had actually the courage to make a decision. The same way they scrapped the ETS, and the same way they're not prepared to take the ETS to the next election. They should tell Australians now that they will step back from this tax.
Let's see what Richard's got to say.
Well, I think if we ought to be having some sober language in this. People have been accusing us of class warfare, but you only need to listen to Matthias talking about the way in which he's described it, and the language of class warfare is on the other side. Look, what is clear here is that what we had was a bad tax in the system of state royalties, which was there to try and get a value for the Australian people from a resource which belonged to them. Now, all I can hear from Matthias is saying that we ought to be going back, or we ought to stay with the existing system of state royalties. Now, if the opposition is saying that, well, can I say they are one out? There's not an economist backing them on that. There's not a single economist backing them on that. Every economist out there is saying a taxation regime based on royalties, which is a tax on production, stifles the production process.
Do you think that there's a chance of a compromise before the election with the mining sector?
Well, look, I think what we have put out there is the architecture of a scheme, and I think that's clear.
But is there any chance of getting them on board?
Well, the architecture of the scheme is out there, and that is what we are selling, and that is what we're backing in. There is obviously a consultative process going on, and I'll leave that to the people who are involved in that process.
Where does that leave you, Matthias, if there is an agreement? You've gone very hard with the campaign against?
Well, we've gone very hard because that's the right thing to do.
If there's a compromise, you're isolated.
And like the reality, just taking up Richard's point, the AWU, the Australian Workers' Union, they let the cat out of the bags. They're saying what the government is thinking. So the campaign that the Australian Workers' Union is running against so-called rich, fat mining bosses, that is what the Labor Party is motivated by. Now, in terms of what's going to happen moving forward, we'll be guided by what is in the national interest and what is in the interest of the Australian economy and jobs. And this lazy tax grab from the Rudd Labor government is not that.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. Thank you both for your contribution today, Richard Marles and Matthias Cormann. Appreciate it. Thanks. We're going to look at the